Here is why I think Martin Luther King's strategy for civil rights was the best. My thesis statement on this is that King's peaceful, nonviolent protest strategy was the best in terms of trying to deliver a message to moderate white America so that they could pressure the government to make social change. What do I mean by this? Well, Dr. King wanted to move the middle class and upper class of white America. Now, you would be thinking, why not, citizens of, like, black citizens of America? As he was also trying to do that as well, at the time, black citizens really did not have much say or opinion as they were treated very unequally compared to their white counterparts. And so, if King managed to change and sway the opinion of all white middle class and upper class citizens and spark an outrage in them so that the government can see that and make a social change to them, that would be King's plan, and that would work. Another example of this is the Montgomery bus boycott, which went on from December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956. It began with African American Rosa Parks getting arrested after refusing to give up her seat. Dr. King proposed a boycott the day after, which was effective and caused a very huge deficit in the public transportation systems, financial gain, and business in general. And on top of the Montgomery black residents who were boycotting, even the paying white customers joined the boycott, and that opened many eyes all across America in general. The whole situation got much, much tense that a group called the White Citizens Council, which was against racial integration, firebombed Dr. King's house. And in June of 1956, federal courts found that laws in Alabama and Montgomery requiring segregations on buses to be very unconstitutional. An appeal, though, however, kept that segregation intact until December 20th, 1956. And that is when the U.S. Supreme Court ended the segregation by upholding the district's court rule, in which ending the boycott and paving the way for the civil rights movement's very first important victory. Another very good example of this is the Birmingham Campaign, which began on April 2nd, 1963, and ended May 10th, 1963, only lasting a whole 2 months and 8 days. This started with boycotting led by Shuttlesworth, which was meant to pressure business owners into employing other races in their work besides whites. At first, the campaign received very little media coverage, which made it very difficult to change the minds of many white Americans across the country. And on April 12th, King was arrested for violating the injunction, in which, after being tossed in jail, he then wrote the infamous Birmingham letter. And although King being thrown in jail did not catch much media attention, another event had happened for the media to notice. Thousands, and I mean thousands upon of black school children were marching down the street when Commissioner Eugene Bull ordered officers to use excessive force towards them, such as high-pressured fire hoses, police dogs, and baton beatings. This event had media coverage seen from all across the United States and had sparked outrage all across America. The Children's Crusade had helped convince President Kennedy to send Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Burke Marshall to Alabama to help negotiate for the protests to stop and for peace to happen. And on May 10th, an agreement was reached, and all whites and blacks only signs were removed by Birmingham officials. My final example on this is the infamous Washington March, which also held a lot of famous moments in it. It started and ended on the same day, August 28th, 1963. It had more than over 250,000 participants, and the infamous I Have a Dream speech lasted a whopping 16 minutes instead of the planned 4. There were also many prominent leaders there, such as Randolph, the leader of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, Wilkins, executive secretary of the NAACP, John Farmer, and much more. The march proved to be successful, as it had pressured John F. Kennedy to sign a civil rights bill in Congress a year later. The famous I Have a Dream speech's meaning was that those of African American heritage were long overdue for a promise that was made to them almost 150 years prior. Now, for these next few slides, I'm going to be comparing Dr. King to the other two prominent leaders of the civil rights movement. For the first part, I'll be comparing Malcolm X and Dr. King. So, even though they both fought for the same thing, they had both gone about it in different manners. As Dr. King, he wanted to be more peaceful about his fight rather than fighting, whereas Malcolm X was more of a by any means necessary political renegade, meaning that he would do whatever it took to persuade white America to let black America have the same rights as them. Dr. King wanted both races to work together and live equally together as well, which made him an integrationist, whereas Malcolm X was a firm believer in black supremacy, which is pretty much white supremacy, but only for blacks, as he believed that the black people to be more superior compared to whites and wanted them to be independent on their own. And Dr. King believed that nonviolent tactics were key to ending racial segregation and racial violence, as he had wanted no more African Americans to be hurt in this process. Whereas Malcolm X advocated for black militancy as self-defense against white aggression. So pretty much think about being able to just fighting back against law enforcement during protests. That's pretty much what Malcolm X was fighting for. These two pictures are, I'm sure everyone knows that that's Dr. King, and as well as that is Malcolm X. Trying to compare Dr. King to Thurgood Marshall is a bit strange, as both were fighting for the same thing, but in vastly different manners. What I mean by this is that both Dr. King and Malcolm X were fighting through speeches, protests, etc., anything with civil disobedience, as I had said right here for Dr. King. But Thurgood Marshall was fighting for civil rights through the courts. He basically built the legal foundation for MLK's challenges on segregation. So in a sense, without Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King's entire campaign most likely would have been vastly ignored by the majority of white America and probably would not have gone anywhere. And as I had mentioned, Marshall took the fight for civil rights to the courts and was opposed to civil disobedience, as he had believed that taking it to a more legal standpoint would persuade moderate white America to change their minds on racial segregation. And these two pictures are of Thurgood Marshall and of Dr. King. How did Dr. King manage to persuade all of moderate white America to join the fight for civil rights? There's three simple options. The first one being peaceful protests. The second one being the speeches, like persuasive speeches. And the third one being the risks that he took. Now, for the first one, peaceful protests, what I mean by that is movements such as the Montgomery boycott, the Albany movement, the Birmingham campaign, and the Washington March. Four most notable protests in Dr. King's civil rights career. On Dr. King's end, he had protesters who were all peaceful. There was no violence coming from his end of the fight, whereas compared to the other sides, such as Malcolm X is really the only one you could say, there was some violence. And then also going to saying that law enforcement in almost every town that he had been in were also using excessive force and violence against his cause. And for moving speeches, when we think of Dr. King's speeches, we think of one speech in general. We think of the infamous I Have a Dream speech, in which Dr. King had spoken for about 16 whole minutes. And the message of the speech pretty much sums up to that the black citizens of America were long overdue for their freedom, happiness, and integrity, as despite being freed from slavery, black Americans were still treated no less equal than anyone, like just garbage. They were treated terribly, and they still really hadn't been treated like proper citizens. And for taking risks, um, if you think about it in general, his entire fight for civil rights was a whole huge risk in general, as the lynching of black citizens at the time was not an uncommon thing, especially in the South, where his fight was mostly at. Uh, one prom- one prominent risk for me is the Birmingham campaign, in which Dr. King, he knew he had a warning from the law, and if he were to break that warning, he would get thrown in jail. And so he had the decision of either not going out and joining his protests or joining it and taking the risk of being thrown in jail. And in which he did take the risk and he was thrown in jail. But that action had inspired thousands of black school children to walk the streets, and the actions taken from law enforcement using excessive force like hoses, attack dogs, police batons, everything like that, you name it, had sparked outrage in most middle class and upper class households in America, like specifically white middle class and white upper class households in America. And that is why I think Dr. King's approach to fight for civil rights was the best strategy compared to Malcolm X and Thurgood Marshall.